They said a foreign doctor had no place in their town. She said he had saved her son. The doctor arrived in Copper Basin, Idaho Territory, in the spring of 1885, and the town decided it did not want him before he had finished unloading his wagon. His name was Henrik Dahl, and he had come from Norway by way of Minneapolis, where he had practiced medicine for 4 years, before the winters and the crowding and the particular grinding loneliness of a foreign man, in a city that was not quite foreign enough to excuse his accent, but not quite familiar enough to overlook it, had driven him west, where the spaces were larger, and the mountains were higher, and the populations were smaller, and where he had heard that a doctor was needed in the mining towns of the Idaho Territory. He was 33 years old, tall and fair-haired, and quiet in the way that Scandinavians are quiet, which is not shyness, but a cultural preference for speaking only when speaking adds something to the silence. He spoke English fluently, but with an accent that was precise and careful, the English of a man who had learned it from grammar books and medical textbooks, and who treats each word as a guest that deserves proper accommodation. He carried a black leather medical bag that had belonged to his father, who had been a doctor in Bergen, and the worn bag contained instruments and tinctures and bandages and a small leather-bound pharmacopoeia written in Norwegian that he consulted when the English names for herbs escaped him. Copper Basin did not want him. Copper Basin wanted an American doctor, a doctor who spoke without an accent and who prescribed medicines with names they could pronounce, and who went to the same church and ate the same food, and who understood, without being told, the particular customs and assumptions that govern how people in a small American mining town expect to be treated by the person who treats their ailments. Henrik Dahl was not this doctor. He was a foreigner. The word followed him like a shadow. Foreigner, spoken in the general store and the saloon and the church steps after Sunday service. Spoken not with hostility, but with the particular wariness that small towns reserve for people who are different, in ways that cannot be immediately categorized, and therefore cannot be immediately dismissed. He rented a room above the assay office on the north end of Main Street. The room was small and cold, and the window looked out on the tailings pile from the Copper King mine, which was not a view that inspired confidence in the future, but which was adequate for a man who was accustomed to adequacy. He set up his practice in the front room, a wooden examination table he built himself, 2 chairs, a shelf for his instruments, a cabinet for his tinctures. He hung a small sign on the door that read, Henrik Dahl, M.D., and he waited for patients. The patients did not come. The people of Copper Basin treated their illnesses the way they had always treated them, with home remedies and patent medicines, and the services of Mrs. Eaton, who was not a doctor, but who had delivered most of the babies in the basin, and who prescribed whiskey and camphor for everything, and whose prescriptions had the advantage of being familiar if not effective. The woman who changed this was named Vera Aldrich. She was 28 years old, and she was a widow with a son named Caleb who was 6. Her husband, Frank, had died in a mine collapse 18 months earlier, and Vera had stayed in Copper Basin because the mine had paid a small death benefit, and because the house was paid for, and because leaving required money and energy and a destination, none of which she possessed in any sufficient quantity. She worked as a laundress, taking in wash from the miners and the merchants and the boarding house, boiling shirts and trousers in a copper pot in her yard 6 days a week, and the work was hard, and the pay was poor, and the combination of hard work and poor pay had given her the particular expression that women in mining towns develop, an expression that is not defeated, but is past the point of expecting anything to improve. Caleb got sick in June. The sickness started on a Monday with a fever that Vera attributed to the heat, and progressed by Wednesday to a cough, and the cough progressed to a rattling in his chest that Vera could hear across the room, a wet, heavy sound that frightened her in a way that she could not afford to show, because she was the only parent Caleb had, and the only parent's fear is a fear that must be managed because there is no one to share it with. She took him to Mrs. Eaton on Thursday. Mrs. Eaton looked at the boy's throat and felt his forehead, and prescribed whiskey and camphor, which was what Mrs. Eaton prescribed for everything from toothaches to snake bites. The whiskey and camphor did not help. The rattling got worse. Caleb's fever climbed. His lips turned blue at the edges. On the third night, when Caleb's breathing had become a labored, wheezing effort that made Vera sit beside his bed with her hands clasped and her jaw tight, she did the thing that desperation makes people do. She went to the person no one else would go to. She went to the foreigner. Henrik was awake. He was reading by lamplight, a medical journal from Oslo that arrived by mail every 2 months, and that constituted his only connection to the world he had left. He answered the door and he saw Vera's face, and he did not ask questions. He took his bag and he followed her through the dark streets, to the small house at the edge of town, where Caleb lay in the bed with his chest rattling and his lips blue. Henrik knelt beside the bed. He examined the boy with the careful thoroughness of a man who does not guess when he can measure. He listened to the chest with his stethoscope, moving it from point to point, listening to each quadrant of the lungs. He checked the throat and the eyes and the fingernails and the temperature, and then he opened his bag and took out a small glass bottle containing a tincture that he had prepared himself from ingredients he had brought from Minneapolis: wild thyme and elecampane and horehound, combined in proportions that his father had taught him and that his father's father had taught before that. A remedy that had worked in the fishing villages of western Norway for generations, and that worked because it worked, regardless of whether the people administering it spoke English or Norwegian or any other language. He administered the tincture with a dropper, 4 drops under the tongue, and he waited 15 minutes and then gave 4 more. He sat with the boy. He sat through the night, checking the breathing every 30 minutes, adjusting the dose every 2 hours, cooling the fever with damp cloths that he wrung out in a basin of cold well water and laid across the boy's forehead and chest. And Vera sat across from him and watched him work with the attention of a mother whose child's life is in someone else's hands, and who is deciding whether those hands can be trusted. By morning, the rattling had eased. By the following evening, it was gone. Caleb's fever broke on the second night, and by the third day, he was sitting up in bed with color in his cheeks, asking for food. And the asking for food was the sound of a child returning from the place where sick children go. And the beautiful, ordinary sound of it made Vera put her hand over her mouth and turn away, because the relief was too large to show, and too large to hide, and too large to do anything with, except stand in the kitchen doorway and let it move through her. "What do I owe you?" she asked Henrik. "Nothing. I will pay you. There is no charge. The boy was sick. I am a doctor. These are not circumstances that require payment." Vera looked at him. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has just done the most important thing anyone has ever done for them, and who has done it without expectation of return. And the looking contained gratitude, and something else, something that Vera could not name, but that felt like the beginning of an understanding. That this man was not what the town said he was, that the foreignness they assigned to him was their limitation, and not his. She told people. She told the women she did laundry for, Mrs. Kelton, the merchant's wife, Mrs. Barnard, the mine superintendent's wife, Mrs. Pryor, who ran the boarding house. She told them that the foreign doctor had saved her son's life, and that he had not charged her, and that his medicine had worked when Mrs. Eaton's whiskey and camphor had not, and that his hands had been steady, and his attention had been unwavering through the long night. The telling did not immediately change anything. People in mining towns are cautious about changing their minds, because changing your mind requires admitting that your previous mind was wrong, and that the people you agreed with were also wrong, and the admitting is uncomfortable. But Caleb was walking around town, healthy and loud and visible proof that the foreign doctor's medicine worked. And visible proof is harder to argue with than rumor. One by one, people came. A miner with a broken finger that had been set wrong and needed resetting. A merchant's wife with a persistent headache that had plagued her for months, and that Henrik traced to her eyesight and corrected with a pair of spectacles he ordered from a catalog in Chicago. A child with an earache that had kept the child awake for 3 nights. A teamster with a gash on his forearm from a harness buckle that needed 12 stitches, and that Henrik sewed with the same careful precision that he brought to everything. Henrik treated them all with the same quiet competence, the same careful attention, the same refusal to hurry, or to perform, or to be anything other than what he was. which was a man who had been trained by his father in Bergen to heal, and who healed without regard for whether the person he was healing thought he belonged in their town. The trouble came in August. A group of miners, 3 men who drank together every evening at the Lucky Strike Saloon and who had appointed themselves the guardians of Copper Basin's character, decided that the foreign doctor needed to leave. They decided this not because Henrik had done anything wrong, but because his presence challenged the particular comfort that comes from living in a place where everyone is the same, and the challenge was intolerable to men who had very little in this world and who had decided that the sameness of their community was one of the few things they had, and one of the few things worth defending. They came to his office on a Tuesday evening. They stood in the street outside his door in the last of the daylight, and they told him to leave. They told him his kind was not welcome. They told him Copper Basin took care of its own, and did not need outsiders practicing medicine on American people. They did not threaten violence, but the threat was implicit in the standing, and the telling, and the number of them. 3 men who were larger than Henrik, and who had been drinking since the afternoon shift ended, and whose flushed faces carried the particular ugly expression of men who believe they are doing something righteous when they are in fact doing something small. Vera was across the street with Caleb beside her. She had been leaving the general store when she saw the 3 men and heard what they were saying. She crossed the street without hesitating. She walked up to the 3 men, and she stood between them and Henrik's door. "Move aside, Vera," said the largest of the 3, whose name was Goss. "No, this is not your concern. He saved my son's life. That makes it my concern. He is a foreigner. He does not belong here. He belongs here more than you do, Leland Goss. He has healed more people in 3 months than you have helped in your entire life. He sat with my boy through the night when Caleb could not breathe, and he did not charge me a cent, and he did not ask me whether I was born in this country or any other country, and he did not ask what church I attended, because that is not what a doctor does. A doctor heals people. That is what he does. He heals people. He heals your people. And you want to run him out of town because his name is hard for you to say, and his accent makes you uncomfortable." The street was quiet. People had come out of the store and the saloon and were watching. The watching was the watching of a town that is being asked in this moment to decide what it is, and the decision is being made not in a meeting hall or a ballot box, but in the street, by a laundress who is standing between 3 miners and a doctor's door. Goss did not move. He looked at Vera. He looked at the people watching. He looked at Caleb, who was holding his mother's hand, and who was standing there, alive and healthy, which was an argument that no amount of prejudice could answer. "Let us go," Goss said to the other 2. They turned and walked back toward the saloon without another word. Henrik opened his door slowly. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, and he looked at Vera. She was still standing in the street, breathing hard, her hand gripping Caleb's hand, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a woman who had just won a confrontation, but the expression of a woman who had just done something that terrified her, and who was still terrified, and who had done it anyway, because the doing of it was more important than the terror. "You did not have to do that," Henrik said. "Yes, I did. They may come back. Then I will be here again." Henrik looked at her. He looked at her with the careful, precise attention that he gave to everything. The attention of a man who observes before he speaks, and who speaks only when speaking adds something to the silence. And what he observed was a woman who was stronger than her circumstances suggested, and braver than her station required, and who had done for him the thing that he could not do for himself, which was stand in the street and declare that he belonged. "Thank you," he said. "You saved my son," Vera said. "I am keeping the account even." But the account was not even, and could not be made even. It was the beginning of a ledger that neither of them could close, and neither of them wanted to close, because the entries in it, a child healed, a doctor defended, a night spent sitting beside a boy's bed, an afternoon spent standing in a street, were not the kind of entries that balance out. They are the kind that accumulate, that build upon each other like stones in a wall, until the wall becomes a house, and the house becomes a home, and the 2 people who built it look at each other across the table and realized that the building has been love all along. Quiet and practical, and stubborn. The kind of love that does not announce itself, but simply shows up when it is needed, and does not leave.